Welcome to the InStory show, where we're going to help you find your story and tell your story and live your purpose. And this season is the summer edition, and our focus is going to be on empaths, highly sensitive people, intuitives, and how do we turn those sensitivities into our strengths, and how do we do that through the power of our stories. So today I am thrilled to welcome Julie okay, tell me again how to say your last name. I meant to ask you before we started.
Bjelland.
Bjelland, that's right. So Julie Bjelland is a psychotherapist, author, and leader in the field of high sensitivity and has helped thousands of highly sensitive people around the world. As an HSP herself, Julie understands what it is like to live with high sensitivity and strong emotions. And she is on a mission to get more empowered HSPs living their best lives in the world. Julie teaches an online course for HSPs and is the author of several books. In her free time, Julie loves being in nature, around animals, gardening, reading, and daydreaming about having a little farm one day. She shares her home with her chef partner, 2 children, and a house full of pets and plants. So welcome, Julie. So glad that you're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here, talking about my favorite subject.
I know, and I love these interviews because of that. So I want, as with everyone, to start with a little bit of your story. And how did you come to know you were a highly sensitive person, and kind of what was it like for you before you knew there even was such a thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I always knew I was sensitive because, from the time I was very little, I think a lot of people are probably going to relate to this, just that feeling of being told, why are you so sensitive? What's wrong with you? Why are you responding that way? It was very obvious that I had a different experience than a lot of the people around me. And oftentimes, I think for much of us, including myself at the time, that really showed up as feeling like there was something wrong with me. And I guess in the process of that, that impacts self-esteem, it's just like a domino effect on just about everything. So I learned about it in terms of it being an actual scientifically proven trait. So the first time I learned about that was through Elaine Aron's work. And she was really the pioneer of discovering this trait, researching it, and kind of bringing it out. So sometimes I feel like I'm kind of like, grabbing the baton from her and kind of helping to pass along, just information to help support HSPs and to living their best.
So I want you to back up a little bit more, and I'm really interested in the difference between going through life when you don't know and when you do, and like those turning point moments, like how did you, like even before like you met, like saw Elaine's work, did you start to find your way to be, like what are the ups and downs, a little more of the ups and downs you went through? Because the reason I'm asking for more detail is that I think a lot of people don't know if they are an empath or they're highly sensitive, or is that what that was?
Yeah.
So what did that look like? Say a little more about that.
I think that in terms of like how my experience as a sensitive person when I was younger, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, just really getting impacted by things. If I saw an animal hurt, if I saw, if I felt like, the world, like modern world, there's so much that we can be exposed to. It's like being a sponge and just taking it all in and not understanding how to, to feel like you can protect yourself with that, how not to absorb everything. So I was really just so sensitive that I would find myself kind of isolating sometimes. And I was afraid to be vulnerable. That was really hard for me to be vulnerable because I think you feel so exposed as a sensitive person. That impacts everything with being hard to connect deeply with people. It gets in the way of a lot of things. There's anxiety can come out of that. There's a lot of things that I wanted to do and accomplish in the world, but I felt like maybe I couldn't do it because I was so sensitive that just getting through the day seemed hard sometimes. because you're so impacted by so many things that are going on around you, and you need a lot of recovery time. If you get impacted by something as a sensitive person, and also just everything that you take in. So there was a lot of overwhelm, and that certainly shuts us down. And I think it cuts off of our gifts and the positives that come with this trait. It's kind of like a coating that holds all those gifts down. And I think that was a lot of my experience. And in the process, it was kind of like, felt like I was in survival mode, just trying to get through the day. But I wanted more. And especially after I had children, you sort of get forced into the world a little bit more when you have children, and you've got to get to their schools, and you got to meet with the teachers, and you have to advocate for them and their needs. And you get a lot more, you can't really hide so much when you're a parent. And I think when my kids were really little, that was a real turning point for me in terms of like, I've really got to work on this. And I think one of the first things I did was like, I'm going to go to a therapist and I'm going to tell him I need to work on my self-esteem. That's what I thought it was about at that time. I didn't even know about the trait. But there's something so magical that happens when you learn about the trait and you realize that there's people like you in the world that experience things the way that you do. And there was so much healing that happened to me. I was really healed, even understanding like the evolution of the trait, why we exist in the first place, was very healing for me.
So I'm going to have you say a little bit about that, because I think that people who, whether you think of yourself as being an empath or highly sensitive, both those titles are now these whole new ways of finding your strength and bringing it out in the world and knowing what you're supposed to do and feeling like there's not something wrong with you. I think that's why I asked you for a little more, because a lot of the stories I hear about people were pathologized, and I don't know what job did you do before you do what you're doing now?
I trained guide dogs for the blind, actually.
That's a great job for a sensitive person.
Yeah, it was working with animals was wonderful. Yeah.
That's so interesting, because a lot of people really shut it down so much that they did a job where they completely had to shut down that part of themselves. So, all right, so say a little bit about, because you're focused, like some people are really focused on being an empath in that way, sort of that way of talking about sensitivity, and you're really focused on talking about being a highly sensitive person and that way of thinking about it. So tell us a little bit about the whole concept that this is a trait, like it's actually a real thing. It's not something wrong with you. You should all be cheering, but let's hear, and you'll hear why.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's such an important piece so the trait itself is about 20% of the population has this trait. It's scientifically proven. We have brain studies that prove it exists, and we actually have brain differences. So if you're looking at 10 people, 2 of them are going to be highly sensitive. And it's also scientifically known as sensory processing sensitivity. But it's not a disorder, and that's important to recognize. And so about 70% of us are introverts, 30% extroverts. It's equal in gender, and they've already found it in over 100 species. And it evolved for a reason. Like, this was a survival strategy of the population. So you're needed. We call them HSP for short, so highly sensitive person, HSP, so you'll hear me call it as HSPs a lot. And so HSPs were the ones, like if you think about when we lived out on the land in tribes, for example, we were the ones who knew, where was it safe to have the tribe? Is another tribe, can you trust them? These extra information that we have as sensitive people, we actually bring in more information. We have to process more as a result. So if you think about like, we call them non-HSPs, if you don't have this trait, say you're bringing in about 3 tubes of information into the brain, an HSP could be bringing in 50 to 100 tubes of information. So you're taking in a lot, and that makes us really different from each other. And I think it's really important to understand that this part of you is needed in the world. I think much of us, because we're part of the minority, that we get messages that we are supposed to change and try to be more like non-HSPs, but in all of my work, it's really important to me for HSPs to understand that you are needed as you are. You have such a special set of gifts. I think you have a supercomputer brain. That's what I call it. It is like having a supercomputer brain. You can read micro expressions, for example, that 80% of the population misses. So there's such important pieces to this. And we just have to work on how do we live in today's modern world while being a sensitive person, because nobody really gave us a manual about, how do you exist as a sensitive person in today's world. So it's a really important, I cannot stress enough for people to learn about this trait and about themselves in it, so you really understand why you are here. They have these interesting studies that they've done where they did one where they had these different species, and the non-sensitive ones got stuck in a trap, and the sensitive ones didn't, because they had information that was like, something's not right about that. So this extra information really is needed. And I'm always telling, like, even companies, like, you should hire HSPs because you're going to get a lot of information that you wouldn't have otherwise. But we also can't live in the way that a non-HSP might live. The 9 to 5, the constant, the constant stress of life. We have to take care of ourselves and our systems a little bit more.
Okay, so it's just so exciting to have this talked about, because it's such a reframe. I gave, Judith Orloff has a book, she comes in from the empath side about the empath survival, and one of my clients read that book and it reframed her entire life. And I hope that's what's happening for some of the people listening as you're speaking. It's a very big reframe. So we'll get into kind of like how it made people feel like they weren't enough. Like, I think that was that's a big consequence, not being good enough. But before we kind of tap into that and kind of a process that you have that might help with that, is talk about some of the basic things that a highly sensitive person or an empath really needs to do in order to be able to function in the world.
Yeah, well, we actually recommend that we have downtime where you're alone every day. We're actually recommending 2 hours a day. And some of this comes from Elaine Aron's research. Some of it comes from anxiety research, different things like that. We're also recommending a whole day off a week and even a week off a season. And I know a lot of people think that that's totally impossible, but sometimes we have to change what we're doing. I mean, I work with people all over the world, and we start the process of making change. I was somebody that used to live in that world where you're working, not having time alone, just doing. And then I was totally off center. And I think a lot of us are living that way. So as soon as you get that experience of living more centered and having that space, because I think that there's 3 things that has to happen during that downtime is brain processing time, because you're taking in so much information, you need to process it. We're thinking about every detail. I was just talking to a client today in fact, about talking about a move that was coming. For the HSP brain, you're thinking about a million different things with that move. And you need to process a lot of that stuff. So there's processing, and then there's time that's needed for rest. That means not taking in new information, having sensory rest, since this is a sensory sensitivity. If you think about the 5 senses, some people are more sensitive to light or sound. There's textures, lots of things like that. So you think about what impacts you. I can even think, for example, before I knew about this trait, and maybe I'd go to a busy, crowded restaurant and sitting in the middle of the restaurant. So that's like a 360-degree, of constant sensory noise. And I'd get home and I'd be so irritable and so I'd just feel sick almost. And I didn't understand what that was. And now I'm like, okay, let's not go at rush hour. Let's sit by a wall. So we have, or, somewhere close to something where there's a little bit of a space. It's not as crowded. And also things about giving myself more downtime afterwards and before if I'm going to be around a group. So then the third thing would be restoration. And I think a lot of HSPs can do the rest, like the rest part, but the restoration is really refilling those energy tanks. So if you've been out in the world surrounded by lots of people and chaos, you're going to need, that those energy tanks get depleted very quickly. I often talk about it in terms of like, if you imagine you had 100 points of energy for the day, and just going out into the world for some sensitive people is going to take out a lot of those points. So you've got to restore that, and just having that information, because if I know that the sensory stuff is making me feel that way, I can do something about it. If I'm unaware of it, I don't know what's causing it. Like I've talked about this in some of my books, like even parents, they're getting home from work and they're cooking and the stove fan is on and the kids are asking them questions and there's all kinds of chaos and the TV's on, and, that's too much sensory input. And then they would, be exploding at home, and then that would cause relationship problems. So, to know that stuff is great. It's like, okay, let's teach our family while we're cooking that we can't be answering all these questions. Let's turn off the TV. Let's reduce the sound and the sensory input, and things get better. So that's just kind of a simple example.
I love that. And, like I remember listening, I can't remember who it was, talking about being a highly sensitive person. I went, but I didn't think I could because I'm an extrovert. So it turns out that's not true. You can be highly sensitive and an extrovert. And I have that same thing. My children used to say to me, Mommy, go for your walk.
I love that. My kids would say, do you need a bath? That was my thing, was like, okay, the bath, being in the water. Love it.
Right, so I'm in Portland, Oregon. I'm near the forest, and everybody knows, oh yeah, Devorah's always taking pictures and in the forest all the time, because as soon as I would say whatever it was, if I go in the forest, it will be fixed by the time I come out.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I didn't know why. Right?
And to do it intentionally, right? Because I think that
I to do it.
Yeah.
Know that.
Yeah. The busy life, it's like we need to intentionally make ourselves go into nature because it's healing.
Right. So here's part of the difference that happens by knowing this. So I would sometimes, especially in starting this whole business, everything, I'd be like, well, is it really okay that I should be working on something? But even so, even without like all of that scientific knowledge, I knew, and this is probably true for a lot of people listening, I knew I can't lead if I don't go take this time. I don't have what to say. I don't have the ability to say it, to be present, to be connected, to bring in other content. And so, but I had to almost tell myself that the outer world's kind of judgment that only when you're busy are you valuable, like that whole cultural thing, you have to fight against it. And this knowledge, I think this is going to help people so much with that, with taking a stand, that being busy all the time is not necessarily the most effective strategy.
Absolutely. I always say that an HSP doing nothing is an HSP doing something, because that's the brain processing time. And then I'm sure you hear this a lot too, is like we hear a lot about, no, I don't have time to take that time to slow down. But I always challenge people to say like, okay, try it for 1 week. I want you then to tell me how you felt. And I've never had somebody come back to me and say, it didn't work. They always say, wow, I had more energy. I was more efficient, more effective, more focused. Because when we're overwhelmed and depleted, we don't have access to like those cognitive parts of our brain that we need. So getting that downtime, getting that time in nature is actually going to make you have more of your resources available.
Right. And this is why part of what motivated me to do this series on this topic, because the people who come into our world, we reflect each other, and we are starting to see, I see so many people who, as a child, they were a certain way. They had these beautiful, intuitive, creative, empathic abilities, and then they got so slammed that now they get to have it back. And so I think this is, and then maybe we'll do a process with you. I think this has led to a lot of us being so hard on ourselves because the society around us, our family, they didn't know better. They didn't support how we naturally are.
Definitely.
That's not good enough.
That's a big part of what I see in the population I work with, is that of HSPs, that this default setting that we seem to have, that we're not good enough or we're doing something wrong. And I think, we've gotten so many messages about, from even subtle messages way back in our childhood about, you should be this way. Why are you this way? Right. And as a child, you take that in and you think, yeah, there's something wrong with me then. And you don't even realize, you know, there was a beautiful story a mother shared with me about an orchid and her daughter. And I love this story. And she says, her daughter says to her one day, you know, Mom, why can her daughter was a highly sensitive child. She said, why can my friends do all this and all this stuff? And why is it hard for me to do this stuff? And the mother said, you know how dandelions just kind of grow everywhere? And then there's orchids. Orchids need a special kind of care, but when they bloom brilliantly. Isn't that a beautiful story? So I actually keep orchids around as a reminder that I am an orchid, and yes, I take a little bit of special care, but when I've got the right conditions, I can bloom brilliantly, and so can you. All of the HSPs can do that, and I love that story. I just think it's amazing.
I love that too, and a lot of the work I do work with image and metaphor, and they're very, very powerful. And those images and metaphors for what make us unique are extremely helpful and empowering. So I love that. Well, I would love to do a process with you that we talked about before we went on live. I think that will help people with this whole overwhelming thing about not being good enough.
Yes. Well, the self-compassion practice is something that I found incredibly helpful for HSPs. It's protective. You know, there's a lot of us that find it difficult to be exposed or be vulnerable, to receive criticism. Things like that can be really difficult for a sensitive person. And so I found that there's this practice, and I've adapted it from Kristen Neff's work, and she's really specializes in this in self-compassion. That's her whole work is around that, but I've kind of adapted it for the HSP, and it's got 3 steps. And one of the things that's really powerful about this, and I'm really interested in the brain and how to use certain techniques, because I find it amazing that you can intentionally light up certain sections of your brain that deactivate other centers.
Wow.
So for example, most HSPs have a higher stress center. It's activated more. We've got more activation in the amygdala, for example. That's the fight, flight, freeze response. And when you have that more activated, anything that's more activated grows in the brain. And so the more we activate it, the more it grows and the more it becomes a problem. So if you practice this self-compassion technique, it's actually a brain training technique that you can literally light up sections that are more calming sections. Because what's so fascinating is they can't be activated at the same time. Because I think about that for a second. If you're ever really stressed or something and somebody says, okay, I want you to really concentrate on what you're grateful for example, notice that when you are really sitting in gratitude, you don't feel the stress, because they can't be activated at the same time. So I find that amazing. Like, there's things that you can do that help control your experience. And I think that feeling of being a little bit more in control really helps a lot as a sensitive person. So this step, the first step is you can put your hands here. There's proprioceptors here that are calming. Some people like to do this one. I happen to like this one. And in the first step, we bring up, so if you want to practice and bring up something, you know, that you're wanting to talk about the emotions in the first step. So bringing up something maybe you were hard on yourself about, something that was difficult. And then you want to name the emotion, because just naming the emotion comes from cognitive brain. Oh, and I'll say this one thing quick too that gives a little bit more information about it. Think of the brain as just having these 2 parts. You've got the emotional brain and the cognitive brain. When the emotional brain gets too activated in a sensitive person, the cognitive brain goes to sleep. And that's why when you're really upset about something or really activated emotionally, notice how you can't find facts very well. You lose some of your memory. You can't think about what to say. You might be spinning in circles in your head. So this technique actually is part of reactivating that cognitive brain. And as soon as that's activated, that's there to support. That's how, you know, when you calm down after getting upset and you see everything seems a lot clearer now, right? That's why. It's because the cognitive brain got turned back on. So just naming the emotion comes from cognitive brain. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to practice that and bring up something and think about the emotions that are around it.
So like I'll have that feeling of being like ashamed or embarrassed because I think I'm not as good at running my business as other people. I have kind of that classic creative ADD personality. And I went through, first I went through my husband being upset about it. And now we've kind of got that worked out. And then I went through, oh my gosh, who am I to run a business? I can't possibly, I was embarrassed. I don't feel that so much now, so I can bravely talk about it here while I'm running this interview for my business. But it makes me bump up the feeling like I'm kind of embarrassed.
Yeah, let's bring that. That's a great example. And it's great to start with something that maybe you've already worked through a little bit, but it's a good place to start so that when you enter, I call it the epicenter, the really big things, you've got a little practice to get you there. So let's bring that up. You said it gave you, name the emotions around it, made you feel embarrassed.
Made me feel kind of embarrassed, kind of like ashamed of myself, like what's wrong, like there's something wrong with me. So that feeling of just I don't, can use being embarrassed and ashamed like that. Those are sort of
Yeah, we can use those. And notice how you actually have to find the words, right? To say it, which is part of turning the cognitive brain back on.
Right, so, that's true. It's like, well, how do I say what I was feeling? Right?
Yeah, and in fact, some of the research shows just by finding the words to what you're feeling cuts the impact of it by 50%.
Yeah.
Just by finding the words. And then the second part of it,
you can change it, right?
Yeah, and then you get that cognitive access a little bit better. The second part of that is we want to normalize and validate. This is incredibly important for HSPs because we've spent a good portion of our life feeling not normal and feeling invalidated for the feelings that we have. So to be able to just normalize it by, I like to start with validation, to say, even to start a sentence with, it makes sense that I feel, it makes sense that I felt embarrassed, or
it makes sense that I felt embarrassed or maybe overwhelmed also by the details of a business because I'm very sensitive and creative.
Absolutely. See, that's really good. And then the normalization is, I like to say other HSPs, or you could say empaths too, would probably feel this way too. So now you're normalizing it within your community.
Right. Like lots of other creative entrepreneurs feel this same feeling, like who am I? That feeling of, who am I to be doing this? Because I can't do this, this, or this.
Yeah, perfect. So that's already moving through the second. And then the final one is, I like to add in, what do I need right now in this moment to help me through this, to make me feel better? I mean, it could be as simple as, you know what, I haven't eaten. I need to eat something. I need to take a break. Let me step outside. Maybe I need to ask for a hug from my partner. That would be a moment of just kind of checking in. What do I need right now when I'm in this feeling this way?
And so for me, two things come up. One is I need to go be in the forest where I feel whole and complete and good. And then the other, I think, is I need to talk to other people who might share a similar experience. Because I'm so about telling your story, I might need to tell my story in a place where someone will go, that's amazing. Me too. I get it. Yeah.
Because that helps normalize it.
Right.
Absolutely. So I love it. So you already found, so if you actually went into the forest and then talked to other people, you're going to feel a lot better about that emotion that you were having. Right. And it sounds like such a simple process, but it's really impactful in the brain. And it's because it's a brain training skill, you actually get better at it with practice. So I always say, like, the 10th time you do it, you're better than the first time. And the more you activate that center of the brain, the more access you have to it. Because I know for myself, and I think pretty much every HSP I've ever worked with started out with very little self-compassion. We have a lot of compassion for others.
Right.
Right? But we're really hard on ourselves. And so you start thinking about your self-talk and even just those little moments. So, and I remember when I first started, I had zero self-compassion. I did not like myself at all when I was younger. It was a real problem. And I feel like I'm a completely different person now. And a lot of that has been gaining a self-compassion practice. When I get really overwhelmed, or I get my feelings hurt, or something happens, or I get criticized, or something happens, I can go to that self-compassion practice and sort of coat myself in it. And I use it as an example of thinking about, like, when my son was really little, he tripped and he hurt his knee, and it hurt him a lot. And, by me giving him compassion, like a hug, telling him I'm going to be there for him, even though the pain may have still been intense, he softened in the intensity of how it was impacting him. And it's kind of like that. It's like having a loving, nurturing, self-compassion experience coding everything that's hard.
Yeah, super important. So, okay, so say the steps again.
Yeah, so first step is naming the emotions.
Okay. Right.
Second step has two parts, being able to normalize and validate. And then the third stage is asking for what you need. Mm-hmm. Asking yourself, checking in with yourself, what do you need? Okay. It's a really powerful practice, and you do get better at it. So I actually suggest people practice this every day, several times a day. I mean, there's a lot of times as a sensitive person where something happens that impacts us that we need. And if we don't do it, then these little pieces of wounding are kind of going inside of us. And once we start carrying around a lot of wounding, that's when you see anxiety increasing, depression increasing, things like that.
Yeah, I like this so much because I think so noticing that we have tools that we didn't have before is a big part of this. Because I always say to people, look, stuff is going to happen. Like you're saying, stuff's going to come up. So pick a tool. And, I often will say to people, pause, notice, and shift, or pause, notice, and choose. And that pausing allows you to then, and notice and choose, you could exactly do this self-compassion process, like pause. That noticing is that naming of the emotion. And then really, I really love adding that normalizing and validating. Why is this normal? Why is this fine?
Yeah, it's so powerful. I love that you have the same thing, because I always say we're moving from reaction, because when we're in a reaction state, every single time we have to go through a cycle that feels bad afterwards. Mm-hmm. Everybody feels bad if they really react, have a big meltdown or an explosion of some sort of something. You feel bad afterwards. Mm-hmm. And then you also have to clean up that piece now that you felt bad, or maybe you yelled at someone or something happened that went wrong. And now you got to work on that. And there's shame oftentimes attached to that. So this is moving from reaction. And I say pause, reflect, and respond. So it's very similar to what you were saying. To be able to pause and reflect and respond is just amazing as a sensitive person, because I think much of the time we don't have those tools because we feel things so intensely. And if somebody didn't teach us this, but what's really interesting though is about the research is they're showing that sensitive children that raised by parents that support that sensitivity are less likely to have anxiety and depression than a non-HSP child. But if you don't have that support, which many of us didn't, since our parents didn't even know about the trait, you're more likely to have anxiety and depression.
Right, because once you know what it is, then you have all this resource because you have it inside you. It's just we didn't know how to access it. It wasn't validated. We weren't taught. Super cool. Well, all right. Tell everybody what you have for a free gift, where they can find you, and more of what you teach.
Yeah, well, I have quite a few different, I have books and courses and stuff, but everything can be found on hspresources.com. That's a great place to just kind of find everything. And you'll get access to all of my work if you go there.
Okay,
yeah.
Wonderful. And you can also go to all of the links for this show, and everything that people are offering will also always be at the InStoryShow.com. So people can go there, and if they're like listening in some other time and reality. So leave us with just like a last thought as we wrap up for people to take away with them, because it's so enlightening and exciting. So leave us with a couple last thoughts.
Oh, I want the listeners out there to know how important you are in the world, how valuable you are, and that if you just learn some of these techniques, you learn about your trait, you're already listening to this, watching this video, that means that you're trying, and I love that. And I think that is already a really good step. And I'd say surround yourself with other people that are like you so that you do feel like more normalized, because this is such an important aspect and you are so needed in the world. So I would say that for sure.
Wonderful. I agree. I think that is a huge thing. I think that this is all coming out because I feel like a lot of people have this sense of being called forward, called to something more. And part of it is us learning how to bring these traits of being an empath, of being highly sensitive forward and turning them into our strengths. So Julie, thank you so much for joining us on the InStory show. And everybody, as I always say, remember to go out in the world, share your story, live your purpose, and be a blessing. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.